Good morning. It's Wednesday, April 13th, 2022. It's 8:34 a.m. and we are taking up H606, an act relating to community resilience and biodiversity protection. And to introduce us to the bill is Chair Amy Sheldon from the House Committee on Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife. Good morning, Chair Sheldon. Thanks for coming down.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. For the record, Amy Sheldon. I represent Middlebury in the legislature. And happy to be introducing H606, which is the Community Resilience and Biodiversity Protection Act. It's a bill that sets a goal of conserving 30% of our lands by 2030 and 50% by 2050. It defines 3 categories of conserved lands and requires the Agency of Natural Resources to inventory and assess progress in meeting the goals. It also requires the agency to develop an actionable plan using conservation design as a guide to achieve 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 goals, and make recommendations to the legislature for funding and programs that will ensure we meet those goals. This bill is about making wise investments in climate adaptation and mitigation for both wild and human communities. It builds on the great conservation work and policies that are ongoing in our state to ensure that we conserve necessary elements of our landscape before they and the invaluable services they provide for our communities are lost to development. Conserving an adequate amount of undeveloped land is one of the simplest ways we can address climate change and biodiversity loss. Having an intact and connected landscape with natural and working lands will mitigate the effects of flooding on our towns and villages. It will reduce the impacts of drought by reducing the risk of fire and increasing aquifer recharge. It will protect biodiversity by providing habitat and allowing for the migration of species both north and uphill in the face of a warming climate. It will improve our shared air and water quality, ultimately leading to improved public health outcomes for Vermonters. Additionally, conserving an intact and connected landscape will benefit our economy in the short and long term. Open space and access to the outdoors are the foundation of our lifestyle and the Vermont brand, and are essential to our natural and working lands and outdoor recreation economies. Conserving these spaces will also reduce the significant economic impacts from climate stressors like increased flooding and prolonged drought, and help reverse biodiversity loss and land conversion, which economists estimate costs the global economy several $1 trillion annually. Finally, H606 will ensure that the Vermont we know and love today is here for our children, grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. And I won't walk you through all the details of the bill because that's what you'll do with legislative council. But I do want to say that I reread the findings section, and I highly recommend spending time with the findings. They're very edifying, and they do lay out the reasoning for the need for the bill and the goals of the bill. The definition section is critical to this conversation. So you're probably likely aware that President Biden has embraced the goals of 30 by 30 for our country, in addition to other countries around the world embracing the goal. But what's key to embracing the goal of conservation at this scale is the definition of what conservation is. So we spent a lot of time working on those 3 definitions, and they are essentially a tiered ladder of most protected to least protected lands. And that's the foundation of this bill, very much. And then the conservation goals are more broadly accepted and have been accepted by the scientific community. The 50 by 50 in particular, well laid out by the late E.O. Wilson in his book, Half Earth, which I highly recommend. And so those are the conservation goals. And then,
Sorry, in which book did you cite?
Half Earth, E.O. Wilson, among many, many other resources. There's a growing consensus around by conservation biologists that this is definitely the path we need to be on. I think other critical points about the bill. So there are the definitions, the goals, and then the plan itself, which is framed around Vermont conservation design. And the other key piece here is that we've been doing great conservation work in Vermont. And we have a community of professionals who have been working on it for decades. And at the same time, we have Vermont Conservation Design, which is actually a guide provided to us by the Fish and Wildlife Department for how to conserve the vast majority of Vermont species, not all of them. And I assume this committee has explored that conservation design at different times, but I highly recommend re-exploring it.
Did we have a joint hearing, room 11, like 2 years pre-COVID? We had a morning full of conservation. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that was an amazing, and you'll see actually in the findings, you'll see reference to the studies. The Nature Conservancy was here for that meeting. Thank you for reminding us. And I think this also acknowledges Vermont's outstanding place in the regional landscape for conservation as climate changes and plants and animals have to adapt, and revisiting that map of how species are going to be migrating both northward and up in elevation.
Like we're a major sort of highway.
We're a highway
connected habitat from south to north.
We are, and there have been 9 connectivity areas identified in a regional connectivity plan, that 6 of which are in Vermont or touch on Vermont, those connection areas. So the goal here is to target our conservation to the areas that we really need it at the time before it's too late, essentially, and use science to guide those decisions. And it's also founded in a recognition that, the vast majority of Vermont is still privately owned, and that private land conservation is key to this. But not just conservation, permanent conservation, but stewardship. And Commissioner Snyder is with you, but he really does a great job of explaining the conservation ladder and understanding the steps it takes for a piece of property to be managed well and conserved in conjunction with private property landowner goals. So this is not about making all these lands public by any means, but it is about an organized and shared effort to protect those lands that we really need. When you think about the biodiversity crisis combined with climate change, which are 2 sides of the same unfortunate coin, land conservation is really one of the strongest things that we can do to mitigate the effects of both of those things.
What's the current status? We're 30 by 30. Where are we today?
So the best estimates we can get right now are between 22 and 24% of conserved lands that meet the definitions that are set forth in this bill. Part of the plan would be a further refinement of the inventory of where we are towards those goals. Through like I said, applying the definitions. It gets complicated because a conserved farm may have cropland and woodland. And so the woodland might meet the goal or the definition of one of the conserved areas for biodiversity protection.
And I know that there's all this sort of planning and funding work that needs to happen to implement things. Did you have a sense that the goal of moving from 22, 24 to 30 by 2030 was reasonable, like a target reasonable target to aim for?
Well, we do, because we said it.
Well, I didn't know if you feel like that's a stretch goal or no, it's certainly achievable given the way we're already doing conservation even absent this plan. If we picked up our game, it would be possible.
I think if we pick up our game, it'll be possible, but I do think that the baseline inventory that we're asking the agency to provide, understanding A, how close are we really toward meeting those goals, and B, laying out the plan for how to do it will answer your question better. So I believe it's a realistic goal that's 7 years away after the plan is delivered, but there is ongoing conservation work. And to be clear, Vermont Conservation Design is already guiding decisions that are being made around land conservation and by both the agency and private entities.
So in terms of current status, like in 2802, in the middle of the bill, it lays out the 30 by 30 and 50 by 50. Currently, do we have any quantified targets in state policy or law for conservation?
I don't believe we do.
Okay. Great. Well, that's very helpful. Any committee questions for Chair Schultz? Chairman McCoy.
Conserve, and I know I haven't read the definitions yet. Conserve, does that mean we'll just leave it in a natural state, or does it allow for some uses?
So yeah, so that's sort of the tiered approach that I was touched on briefly. But so like there are 3 conserved categories identified. Ecological reserve area would be more what you would call untouched. Could be managed for fire suppression or exotic invasives, but essentially left alone. And then a biodiversity conservation area would be the next tier of management level, like managing for a particular species, like we do at wildlife management areas sometimes. So it would involve active management to some extent, but still relatively natural state. And then a natural resource management area would be more what you think of as our working forest lands. And so
would that include logging?
Yeah.
And then there's that 4th tier, sustainable forest management. What's that one?
Yeah, no, so that sustainable forest management is defined because it is referred to in the 3rd definition. Okay. So there are 3 definitions of conservation, and then we felt it was important to add the definition of sustainable forest management.
Oh, I see. Okay, I got it. Next. Anything else you want to emphasize for the committee?
I guess what I would say is that we are a state that is blessed by having Vermont conservation design. We have a leg up. Other states are working on these same kind of goals, but we are actually ready to plan, and time is of the essence. And there is a lot of support for this out there. It was a recommendation in the climate plan, and all the other background that I mentioned in the findings. So I'm very appreciative that you're taking it up. And if there's anything else we can do for you, please let us know.
Okay. Well, there are a few things. Yeah.
No, this is interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. You could check it. If you check your in-basket, you'll see.
The Senate wishes.
Yeah. All right. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Switch over to Ms. Chakowski to do a field walkthrough. And I know we lose you at 9 o'clock to another committee. Thank you. So we'll proceed at pace. Thanks for coming in. We'll try to have that guest flag. I think a guest took that and our bath towels. Actually both out of the committee room.
And the range of readers available would be a real nice addition.
Yeah.
152535. Bye. Morning.
Good morning, Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. So Rep. Sheldon explained almost the entire bill. It's fairly short, but I'll walk you through some of the language. Section 1 is the short title. This is the Community Resilience and Biodiversity Protection Act. Section 2 are the findings. I have to leave in 10-ish minutes, so I don't know if I have time to walk through those right now.
Yeah, let's pass over them because they're straightforward reading.
So that brings us to page 4. So section 3 as a new chapter to title 10, Community Resiliency and Biodiversity Protection. So as you just were discussing, there's a definition section. It establishes 3 types of areas that when conserved will meet these goals. There's also a 4th definition for sustainable forest management. So the first and the most protective area is the Ecological Reserve area. It means an area having permanent protection from conversion of natural land cover and is managed to maintain a natural state within which natural ecological processes and disturbance events are allowed to proceed with minimal interference. Biodiversity conservation area means an area having permanent protection from conversion of natural land cover for the majority of the area and is managed for the primary goal of sustaining species or habitats. These areas may include regular active interventions to address the needs of particular species or to maintain or restore habitats. Natural resource management area is an area having permanent protection from conversion of natural land cover for the majority of the area, but is subject to long-term sustainable forest management. So all three types of areas need permanent protection from conversion. So that's what we're talking about, conserved areas with permanent protection. But as Rep. Sheldon mentioned, there are levels. There's the most protective and the lesser protected areas. And then, so the natural resource management area allows sustainable forest management. And so that is defined as the stewardship and use of forests and forest lands in a way and at a rate that maintains their biodiversity, productivity, regenerative capacity, vitality, and their potential to fulfill now and in the future relevant ecological, economic, and social functions at local, state, and regional levels, and that does not cause damage to other ecosystems. And then finally, there's a definition of conserved. So conserved means protected and meeting the definition of ecological reserve area, biodiversity reserve, biodiversity conservation area, or natural resource management area as defined in this section. So the bill references throughout that 30% of land needs to be conserved by 2030 and 50% conserved by 2050. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about lands that meet the three defined categories set up in this definition section.
And I've been following the bill I don't think we will have to come back to the 5. There was a 4 amendment that changed definition 5 and then follows on in the next section. So later I'd like to come back to that, but let's keep going.
Sure, 5 was added on the floor. It wasn't previously in the bill.
Okay.
So the conservation goals, as we've already mentioned, are in 2802. 30% of Vermont's total land area shall be conserved by 2030, and 50% of the state's total land area shall be conserved by 2050. The Secretary of Natural Resources shall assist the state in achieving these goals. The land conserved shall include state, federal, municipal, and private land. So any types of lands that are conserved, regardless of the ownership, can count towards this goal. Reaching 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 shall include a mix of the ecological reserve areas, biodiversity reserve areas, and natural resource management areas. In order to support an ecologically functional landscape with sustainable production of natural resources and recreational opportunities, the approximate percentages of each type of conservation category shall be guided by the conservation targets within Vermont conservation design, including the use of ecological reserve areas to protect highest priority natural communities and maintain or restore old forests. So it doesn't matter who owns the land as long as it's conserved and meets the definition. And it also says that there can be a mix of the different types of conserved land to meet the 30% and 50%. And then down at the starting at the bottom of page 5 is the conservation plan. So on or before December 31st, 2023, the Secretary shall develop a plan to implement the conservation goals of Vermont conservation design to meet the goals established in section 2802, so the 30 by 30 and 50 by 50. The plan shall be submitted for review to the House Natural Resources Committee and Agriculture and Forestry and Energy and Technology and this committee. The plan shall include a review of the 3 conservation categories defined in 2801 and suggestions for modifications or additions to these categories. An initial inventory of the amount of land in Vermont that is permanently conserved, and to the extent practical, the amount of land the amount of permanently conserved land that generally falls into each of the 3 conservation categories, including public and private land. An evaluation of the impact of intergenerational land transfer trends. A summary of the totality of conservation practices available for reaching the goals of this chapter, including what they are, what they do, how they contribute, and what metrics are available to quantify them. An assessment of how state land will be used to increase ecological reserve areas. The implementation methods for achieving the goals of this chapter using Vermont conservation design as a guide. An inventory and assessment of existing programs that will be used to meet the permanent non-conversion conservation goals of this chapter, and recommendations for new programs that will be needed to meet the goals, and an assessment of existing funding and recommendations for new funding sources that will be needed for acquisition of land, staffing capacity, and long-term stewardship to meet the goals. In developing the plan, the secretary shall hold not less than 3 public meetings on the plan and accept public comments. The secretary shall solicit input from various stakeholders, including private owners of forest and agricultural lands, land trusts, conservation organizations, the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, environmental organizations, working lands enterprises, outdoor recreation groups, indigenous groups, regional planning commissions, conservation commissions, and relevant state and federal agencies. The conserved land inventory shall be updated annually to track progress towards meeting the goals of this chapter. So this is directing that in the next year and a half, the secretary shall work on a plan. It's going to have a variety of elements, but looking at the definition of the conservation categories, doing an initial inventory of how many lands we already have conserved that meet the definitions, some evaluation of intergenerational land transfer, looking at the availability of conservation practices, how state land will be used in this, how to use Vermont conservation design in this process, and then looking at existing programs and funding to meet the goals. So there will be a public process on the plan with stakeholder input, and then thereafter the plan should be updated annually to track progress.
Thank you very much. I have a quick question on page 7, like the 5th line, used to meet the permanent non-conversion conservation goals. So what's that phrase mean, non-conversion conservation goal?
It's sort of redundant because the goals of this chapter are to conserve permanently from conversion land. Okay. So the goals of the chapter are inherently permanent, non-conversion goals.
So with non-conversion meaning that wild land will be developed?
Yes, conversion from one.
Non-conversion?
Right, conversion from the current natural state to a developed state. So prevention of that conversion.
Okay. So in a certain way, like, again, it's like not development. Thank you. Sarah McCormick.
Okay, so this is involving privately owned lands.
Oh, yes.
So in terms of the relationship with the landowners, do we envision being coercive or seductive?
I'm going to say neither, but this is voluntary. So
how do we make them want to volunteer?
I think that you will hear from other witnesses today that there are the option to conserve private land has always been available, and it happens very frequently in Vermont already. And so this is setting a goal, and it can private, municipal, state land can count towards it. Some private land will probably be needed to reach this goal, but it doesn't dictate how much needs to be from private land.
And there are ways in here to incent.
So there aren't any specific incentives, but the plan is supposed to contain some recommendations for that. Yeah, and there's also no explicit, money in here, so we're not necessarily giving money to the agency and saying, go buy land. That's not what this is. We're asking them to develop a plan to reach that next 30 goal, and then the 50% goal will take a little bit more, but the plan is supposed to guide that.
Any other committee questions for Mr. Housekeeper? Perfect timing. Thank you.
Or welcome.
So,
I'll see you in 2 hours.
Thank you. With that, I'd like to invite Secretary Moore to join us at the table. Good morning, Madam Secretary.
Good morning. How are you?
I feel like I've seen you before.
Yes. Commissioner Snyder is here with me. I thought I would offer comments on behalf of the agency, but obviously draw from his technical expertise, but don't know that he intends to provide separate and distinct comments from what I offer.
Sure.
As opposed to me joining you again later, to be part of the secretary's testimony. That works.
Sure, absolutely. So our invitations are always open to however you want to use.
Interpretation.
Prefer that I join Secretary Moore as.
Yeah, we have a second chair over there. If you want to pull up and share the table, do it at the same time. That's absolutely kosher. It's kosher in this house.
Good morning. For the record, I'm Julie Moore. I'm the Secretary of Natural Resources.
Michael Snyder, Commissioner, Forest Parks and Recreation.
So thank you for having us in to talk this morning. Obviously, conservation is really a core component of the agency's work, and we're broadly supportive of the conservation goals in the bill and the importance of a resilient and connected landscape from any number of vantages, including our work around climate action. I think it is important to have a shared definition of conservation, and in A&R parlance, conservation is the wise use of land, as opposed to preservation, which is nearly no use. Preservation is a subset of conservation, but I think this is an important distinction. And when the agency is talking about land conservation and land conservation efforts, we include both of these categories. The agency also uses conservation in referring to a broad suite of tools, like we refer to it as a toolbox, and practices to ensure ecological function and all the co-benefits. Land acquisition and permanent legal protection are but two of the tools in that toolbox. And frankly, we have some significant concerns about those definitions and how permanent was incorporated into each of those categories during the floor amendment in the House debate. Obviously, permanent protection is an important tool, but it is only a tool and needs to make sure we're not overly limiting. The agency does play a lead role in conservation activities throughout Vermont. We own and steward over 350,000 acres of land. And our leadership in this space isn't limited to those direct acquisitions, but also includes conservation initiatives, funding opportunities, direct technical assistance to partner organizations around science and policy and public resources values. And as I know you all know, there are many public, nonprofit, and private organizations that play critically important roles in conserving Vermont's natural resources and our outdoor recreation opportunities. This strong relationship and partnership and collaboration between the agency and these partners is essential to meeting our land protection and conservation goals. I do have a number of concerns with the bill, and most of them tie back to this idea of its narrower focus on permanent conservation. If you look at the president's 30 by 30 challenge, it specifically emphasizes the notion of conservation as opposed to the related but different concepts of protection or preservation. And it recognizes that many of the uses of our lands and waters, including working lands, can be consistent with the long-term health and sustainability of natural systems. And this is consistent with the agency's definitions. I think it's also noteworthy that as drafted 606 excludes agriculturally or lands that have been conserved for agriculture. Those would be in addition to these 30% by 2030 and 50% by 2050 targets. And this starts to represent an incredibly significant percentage of the Vermont landscape.
Can I ask a quick question there? So my understanding is that ag land is roughly 13% of Vermont. So if it excludes it, would we already be then at 22 plus 13, 35?
Yes, I believe that is correct.
Thank you.
Just it would again emphasize the important role of voluntary stewardship that again may not reach that bar for permanent conservation. About 80% of Vermont's lands are in private ownership, which Chair Sheldon noted this morning, and the thoughtful management and stewardship by individual landowners is critical to achieving our landscape scale conservation goals. This is also why use value is such an important tool in this space. It supports private landowners in the thoughtful stewardship of their land, but I don't believe meets the definition of permanent conservation contained in the bill. There's another area that I believe merits further discussion is when we talk about state-owned land. I believe the intention in the way that is framed is it's focused on the 350,000 acres that ANR owns, but both VTrans and VGS also own significant acreage, and it's probably important to clarify what is meant by state land in this regard. Obviously, the directive around developing the report is very focused on ANR, but VTrans and VGS own very significant quantities of land, and I think VTrans's overall holdings actually approaches that of the agency. Other pieces that I would note in there is that the agency really buys and owns lands for many reasons beyond natural features, recreation being many of them, access, public benefit, social well-being, as well as some of the raw material considerations that Commissioner Snyder can speak to in terms of timber. And we consider a full suite of land values when deciding what to acquire and how to manage our existing land holdings. Conservation value is a place that really shouldn't be measured in strictly biological terms, and have some concerns that the bill pushes us in that direction. Whereas we're looking to yield meaningful benefits to Vermonters that are equally distributed, and also to be supportive of local communities and their own conservation goals. And then I would just end by asking sort of what supports are most critical to achieving the stated goals of this bill, whether it's this planning effort versus technical and potentially financial assistance that could be offered as supportive of conservation. I'm sure it comes as no surprise to you that our agency is feeling stretched incredibly thin right now, particularly with all of the climate action work and the federal funding dollars that have been made available. Our staff are down, and I'm concerned that developing this comprehensive plan may not be the highest and best use of staff time, and frankly may come at the extent of some direct conservation efforts. Vermont has a well-established network of conservation organizations. We also need willing landowners in this piece, and then money is no small part. And as I say, conservation is obviously near and dear to the heart and the mission of the Agency of Natural Resources. But I am concerned about what we won't be doing while producing what would be a very significant report that I feel, at least currently, is unlikely to dramatically alter our approach to land conservation.
Yeah, I noticed there's no appropriation here, so.
It would be with existing staff and resources.
Right. Was there any discussion in the development of this about adding resources in order to not say, oh, well, we're simply going to stretch the existing team a little further?
No, that was not asked.
Okay. If that, I can understand how being short staffed, it just means adding stress. If you add programs to implement on top of existing programs, if we were to look at resources for this, does that change the story for the department or the agency?
It addresses a piece of the concern. Certainly capacity is one of the constraints for filling. I think I would leave on the table the question about whether our time and energies are best spent on planning, whether it's within our existing staff or frankly, a slightly augmented staff that additional resources would allow, or if those staff hours would be better directed to technical assistance and support of both our partner organizations and individual landowners and their conservation missions.
So you mentioned in not more than mentioned, the permanent is an important word in this bill. And there was also an amendment on the floor that added detail to how the inventory works. So I think that's sub G on page 7. Can you say something more about what that now entails? I'm sorry, I have the wrong spot here. I'm looking, it was the new sub 5 added, so that's on page 5. That's looking at my wrong note.
It's in the definition section,
Yeah.
correct?
So this was added, and I'm trying to better understand what this did and how this becomes problematic to the implementation of the program.
Do you want
Speak to it?
Yeah.
I think speaking broadly, the concern about permanence is not, we're opposed to permanence. That's a huge part of our work. It's just that it misses, it's like the focus on the endpoint. Representative Sheldon mentioned the conservation ladders, the metaphor I used to our experience, our professionals' experience with landowners is there's a ladder of conservation. It begins with engagement and might even be recreation, it could be current use, technical assistance. These are all pieces of the toolkit that builds towards oftentimes later decisions to permanently conserve. To focus on that single endpoint misses and underrepresents this tremendous body of work that's really important and leads to permanent conservation. So our concern is that single focus on the endpoint misses an enormous body of work that we do that leads to permanent conservation and you might call it more temporary conservation along the way, which is not insignificant.
Yeah.
I hope that helps. That's the kind of the general statement of the concern, that we want to have some openness to include the rest of the toolkit.
And I'm not sure, other than seeking clarity, which was, I think, the genesis of the question on the House floor that led to the amendment. I'm not sure it was because there was an express preference for permanent, being exclusive and thinking about permanent conservation. The question that really generated those changes was seeking clarity about what was meant by conservation. And so I think there are other ways to answer that question.
Okay.
This is but one, and unfortunately is one that we wouldn't support.
So so if I'm understanding that by using this narrow definition, when I think of permanent, I don't know all the different ways that land is permanently conserved, but I think of for land trust, for instance, going out or TNC acquiring.
Buying the development rights,
Acquisition.
extinguishing them, holding an easement that has conservation purposes and goals.
And-
We do the same at the agency. The secretary mentioned our fee simple ownership of nearly 360,000 acres now. We also have nearly 60,000 acres of private land over which we hold those kind of permanent protected easements. So that's the permanence generally in people's minds, that legal constraint that in perpetuity.
Okay. And amongst the tools in your toolkit, my impression is, I don't know, that this is one of the most or more expensive.
Yes.
Acquiring easements that basically deny development
That's right. You're usually paying the difference. Someone's paying the difference. The other piece to be made note here is that, I'm glad you raised the cost of doing it. We tend to focus on the transaction cost, which is indeed big. There are ongoing costs. People tend to check the box, we conserve it, they move on. There's legal monitoring and enforcement. There's actual on-the-ground care and feeding for place for the conservation goals. That's expensive, and it takes staff time as well. So that's another thing to flag, that people generally forget, not just in this conversation about conservation, it's that there's this ongoing stewardship needs to be baked in, and a plan for how to attain it.
Basically need to audit for proper implementation.
Among other
And
responsibilities, that's right.
Okay. All right, all right. So Commissioner Snyder, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add.
I think the Secretary did a great job of covering it very concisely, but comprehensively. I added a couple pieces there, the clarity about the conservation ladder and our sort of where we're coming from, and then the stewardship, ongoing stewardship expense were two pieces I flagged to mention. So I think I'm good, if you are. Sure. Happy to take other questions.
Any questions for the Commissioner or the Secretary?
Okay. This conversation is using a vocabulary that's over a century old. This is the Natural Resources Committee, not the Environment Committee.
Correct.
And resources are things to be used.
Yes.
And conservation is a philosophy of use it at a rate that you keep using it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, don't use it up. How much of this envisions a different view, which is that certain lands have intrinsic value that ought to be left alone? Obviously, I know we can't do that with all. I've got constituents who think that's what I want to do. It's not. Yeah, I know we can't save everything, but what percentage of the land just ought to be left alone for its own intrinsic value?
That's a great question. I think it's one we discussed as part of the H697 that you'll hear later this morning about. There's absolutely a role for things like old growth forests that are left untouched and undisturbed. I think our general feeling is it's a modest but important set of acreage, and it needs to be carefully selected because it already would have some of those intrinsic values. Just walking away from a particular piece of property doesn't necessarily support some of the permanent biodiversity considerations that I think are envisioned in the way this bill is framed. And we have to be very thoughtful about how we pick those particular parcels. That's part of what Vermont Conservation Design starts to get at, is looking at sort of the types of natural areas that are necessary to support our biodiversity goals, some of our climate resilience goals from a flora and fauna perspective. And that there are areas that very much lend themselves to that. And I think, again, we've identified potential tools to help ensure protection of those areas, but short of permanent conservation. I don't know, Michael, if you'd add to that.
The only thing I'd add is that I certainly don't want to speak for them, but I think the bill sponsors would suggest that that's what this is about in terms of the plan. It lays out ecological reserve area. There's three kind of types, and they want us to report back on how to implement VCD for our conservation design, how to be guided by that to protect certain amounts in each of these categories, including the intrinsic for its own. That's the ecological reserve area, you could say. I think it fits that. And so that's part of what's contemplated here is which ones, how much. And that's part of what's being asked, is to use VCD to kind of report back on what is the plan for attaining certain level of protection in that category, among in addition to a couple other categories. I think so. In other words, I think it's contemplated here. It's part of the plan to figure that question.
So the heart of the bill is writing a plan, and I'm just trying to understand, absent this bill, how does, you're already doing conservation work year after year. So how does the bill, I'm just trying to, if I were to ask it in sort of a blunt way, I would say, why do we need the bill if you're already doing conservation work?
It's better answered by others. I mean, respectfully, I think, because that's a great point. I think we do this and we will continue to do this and for similar goals, and maybe more. And maybe we have this totality, I use the word, and we'll report back on the totality of our practices towards conservation. As the Secretary said, I think this is a significant amount of work. Our people do this and they love doing this. And even they're saying, well, this is a lot. So I'm concerned in particular about that, but then also what we wouldn't do. Secretary Moore mentioned that. And we're already right on the edge, and including, willing buyer, willing seller transactions to conserve land for a variety of purposes. So I think we're going to keep doing that, is my point, I hope, whether we have this or not.
And just to be clear, we do have an agency land acquisition plan that guides sort of our review of different parcels that either we see as being available for sale on the private market or that are actually brought to us with sort of a willing seller that has interest in the state taking ownership of a particular parcel. And we're looking at many of the types of criteria envisioned here in prioritizing the resources, financial resources we have available to make those acquisitions.
So, Senator McDonald.
Just if you accept donations as part of the states that people might.
Yes.
We do. Occasionally we decline a donation if it comes with.
I don't want this cement parking lot. Thank you very much.
Well, or this failing dam would be another one we try not to take ownership of.
We'll put you on the list. Clearly.
Right.
Secretary referenced this. I think it bears just mentioning again in this context that to your question, Senator Bray, about like absent this, what it's also referencing these partners that Julie mentioned, our conservation partners all over the state that, it's not just us that keep doing this. I think we do it together. They have strategic approaches as well, and we all kind of put that together. And so that will continue at pace, I hope, as well.
Okay. So I guess would it be more, sorry.
Would you say that your hierarchy of engagement has been truncated? And if this bill were to pass, and you'd like to be able to continue to.
Well, we wouldn't want it to truncate that because, as I say, it leads. It's usually the pathway to permanent protection when that happens, among others. But it's a dominant one. So I don't know that it truncates it. We wanted to include it and recognize it and be part of meeting the goals because we think they do contribute to the goals.
Correct.
That's the difference.
I mean, I think as drafted, Senator McDonald, it would have that, I believe, unintended consequence in asking us to prioritize our efforts around permanent conservation.
So if I'm looking for guidance in terms of the committee, in terms of if we say, okay, we value the permanent conservation goals laid out by the bill, but acknowledge that there's, the impermanent ones are also really important. Is the only reason we're sort of, I think we're being asked to make a choice, like if we start to lean on permanent, it will be to the detriment of the non-permanent efforts. So the only way I see out of that dilemma is that there was more resource brought to the work, so you continue what you're already doing and add this on. So is that a possibility, or I know you're not asking for that. I'm just trying to figure out how the committee proceeds.
Sure. I mean, I think it could be re-looking at the definition of what conserved means and not limiting it to permanent protection. To create a somewhat more expansive definition that incorporates the sort of toolbox that we have at our disposal. Ultimately, the implementation, the successful implementation would require in all likelihood additional resources.
Well, thanks. If you could, so along those lines, if you could examine the bill and send the committee any recommended language changes that address the concern, then that will help us as we proceed, because we'll create more clarity for us if we remove bill and So I would ask that you would consider doing it.
Sure, we're happy to provide sort of a revised definition of conserve that could get at that concern, and then just still would ask you to also contemplate kind of the very real staffing capacity concerns we have at the agency. And just, I appreciate the intention and frankly share the larger goals around conservation, but would be hard pressed to say that this is the highest and best use of staff time at the agency, given everything else we have on our plate over the next 18 months.
If funds were available, could you hire so that you'd be able to supplement your work and continue the current work and supplement it with this other sort of perspective?
I honestly, at this point, don't know. We currently have a significant number of vacancies in the agency, and many of them are not for want of trying to hire people into those jobs. We're in a very different place than we've ever been in my tenure, where at times we felt we were constrained by the number of positions. Right now, we have, I think, upwards of 40 vacant positions. What we're constrained by is finding humans that want these jobs. And so I can't be certain we would find people to take on these roles.
Sure. I think everyone's having trouble staffing.
Yes.
Across the board. Okay, well, I don't mean to press you. I'm just trying to understand.
No, I don't know the answer to your question. It's a fair question, and just our current experience is very different than past experience.
Sure. My sense is when the legislature asks for any operating area to do more work, we should be willing to pay for the cost of asking for additional work. And so, but invest in the program as well as ask you to execute the program. Okay. So if there are no other committee questions.
Just verify, you did say you're down 40 people?
Approximately. Some of that is limited service positions that the agency received to help administer our ARPA funds, and we've been challenged to fill them. So I think we're down approximately 10 permanent positions and have been struggling to fill, actually that's not true, about 20 permanent positions, and have been struggling to fill a number of the limited service positions we were granted for ARPA. So year over year, the agency was slated to grow by 28 positions from FY 21 to 22 with these limited service positions, and currently we're at a deficit of about 10 humans as compared to where we were in FY 21. It's an extremely competitive hiring environment, and frankly, state salaries, I think, are challenging in this space when the private sector has reacted to the labor shortage in a way we're not able to.
Could you just remind us how many total?
ANR has 600 full-time employees, and then they're in the process of adding 400 seasonal staff to largely operate state parks. So in a month's time, will be 1,000.
Environmental issues, the big money is finding the loopholes. That's what makes the big bucks.
So thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
You're welcome to stay, or you may.
Unfortunately, I am unable to stay, but we'll rejoin.
Yeah, figuring you have things,
At
always
11:30.
things to do, probably another committee waiting for you arrive. Or another Zoom session or another Teams meeting.
I do have a team.
I'm
You're staying. All right,
Okay,
excellent. I'll
Thank
be
you
back
again.
later this morning.
all right.
Thank you.
With that, I'd like to turn to Mr. Fidel. Good morning, Mr. Fidel.
Good morning.
The committee would love to hear your thoughts on H606.
Great. Thank you for inviting me to testify this morning. I'm Jamie Fidel. I'm Forest and Wildlife Program Director at Vermont Natural Resources Council and General Counsel. I'm testifying today on behalf of VNRC, but also the Forest Partnership, which is comprised of VNRC, Audubon, Vermont, the Vermont Land Trust, the Vermont chapter of the Nature Conservancy Trust for Public Land, and Vermont Conservation Voters. And here to support and testify in support of H606. And
Mr. Fidel,
yes.
Sure. In addition to the testimony you had already prepared, can you also address the conversation you've been listening into in the last half hour too? That would be helpful.
Yeah, and I'll basically, I think, cut to the chase on a lot of that. And I submitted written testimony, and you've heard a lot of the background that I provided in the first couple pages through the discussions that your committee's been having on issues like how to address forest fragmentation, issues that you've been looking at in other bills that relate to land use. So I think, I think you all know and have heard both from the agency stakeholders, such as the Forest Partnership, that we are really lucky to have a heavily forested state, but our trends right now are that we are losing forest land every year. That's a trend that's becoming more and more concerning based on the acreages that are being lost as projected by the Forest Service. So those statistics are in my testimony here. We've talked about, close to 15,000 acres being converted on an annual basis due to development. VNRC's done our own research showing the clip at which right now we are transitioning undeveloped woodland into a residential status that is increasing based on the in-migration that we've been experiencing in the state. And a lot of the conversations that I've been lucky to have with your committee has generally focused on we need to continue to accommodate the growth that's going to happen in the state. And a lot of it has been, how do we accommodate where there's willing landowners that would like to conserve their land? And how do we promote sound planning, proactive planning in the state so that we can accommodate the growth that we're looking for, but also still maintain a resilient and viable rural resource land base and the natural resource attributes that go with that. So you also, I think, have had a lot of testimony over the years about the importance of forest and sequestering and storing carbon. There's been recent work showing that we're losing our ability to mitigate the impacts of climate change in Vermont because we're losing our forest land base and the services that they provide in mitigating the effects of climate change. And we're actually reducing, as we convert our forests, it's been quantified through some analysis by a report at Clark University, how much we're actually reducing the ability to mitigate emissions as we reduce our forest land in the state. The Global Warming Solutions Act is very proactive in talking about the role that our forest and land conservation needs to play in mitigating the effects of climate change. Going back to 2007, Governor Douglas's Commission on Climate Change prioritized keeping forest as forest. Reducing the rate of forest land conversion was ranked as the second most favorable action out of 38 policies. And we talked about the green bank that we have to maintain. At the time, the state was 80% forested when that plan was developed. And now, when our recently developed climate action plan came out, we reduced the amount of forest land in our state by roughly 5%, and we still have the same goals. In the most recent CAP is a specific strategy, which I believe had the administration's support of investing in strategic conservation in order to increase the pace of permanent conservation towards 30 by 30 targets, with Vermont Conservation Design acting as a guiding plan for prioritization of these efforts. And then I'll just quickly mention that, the need to maintain a resilient landscape is not only tied to maintaining our rural working land space, mitigating climate change, but we do have a looming biodiversity crisis. And according to the Vermont Climate Assessment of 2021, as climate change worsens, 92 bird species in Vermont, including our state bird, the hermit thrush, and the common loon, are expected to disappear from Vermont within the next 25 years. So that's just a quick backdrop as to why we support the goals that are in the bill. So getting specifically to the conversation you were just having, this bill would develop a plan, and we think it makes sense to have a proactive plan. There's no doubt that there are a lot of partners in the agency and a lot of different entities focusing on land conservation in Vermont. And that work needs to continue working with willing landowners. But there is a utility to actually stepping back and saying, what is our proactive plan to working together? How do we identify where there are gaps among policy or programs? How do we, if the climate action plan is calling for increasing the pace at which we're doing it, how do we do it strategically? And how do we do it well? And how do we engage willing landowners? Where are their needs potentially for new incentives. Let's think creatively about this. And I think we would hate to lose the opportunity to do that. And I would think that a lot of entities in the state would be very interested in doing this planning, and we can't imagine doing it without the agency. Financial assistance, the gaps and demands on the agency are real. We recognize that. I think we would say we would absolutely support any financial appropriations that could be made to support this work. And I know the stakeholders that are interested in this work would also look for additional funding to help support this planning effort. I think it would be an attractive thing to bring in some funding potentially for a partnership of people who would be interested in funding this kind of work. We are talking about planning. It doesn't have a direct impact on the ground unless the legislature and the A&R believe in the implementation of the plan. So I think it's important to note that for those who may be concerned that this is going to have some kind of negative impact on private property rights, that the goal of conservation in Vermont has always been to work with willing landowners and achieve their goals. And it's really important to underscore that, VHCB annually testifies on the fact that the demand for farmland and conservation land projects, funding for projects with willing landowners is unmet every year by a 2-to-1 ratio. The funding just simply isn't there. So we have willing landowners that are in the queue. How do we plan to work with them and meet their needs? As was mentioned, there are broad uses and broad values in our lands. The bill does talk about having a diverse, management approach, and Vermont conservation design also has a diverse management approach. And so I guess we don't see the bill as exclusively saying we should focus on preserved lands versus, working in actively managed lands. There's room for both. Conservation of land should address both. And look for the opportunities where we can promote both. So we see this as a bill to advance working lands as much as preserved lands that would have a more passive management approach. This is about maintaining a rural land base for our working lands and addressing the needs that we have for natural lands conservation. And there's a lot of values that Vermonters consistently, when they're polled, rank very high. The value in maintaining the state's character and our open lands and our working lands. And so this bill really is in sync with a lot of support, we believe, from the public. There's diverse tools that are needed. There's no doubt about that. We'd be very interested to understand from the agency kind of what recommendations they would have to understand what definitions would work. We certainly value that there's a suite of diverse tools that are going to be needed to both meet permanent conservation goals or other goals that move us into a conservation sort of status, or working with willing landowners to hopefully maintain the values and functions of a resilient landscape. We think through this planning process is a great opportunity to look at the suite diverse tools that are needed. The bill language actually leaves wide latitude for the agency to actually identify the implementation tools and strategies that would be needed. And that can include the community support that Secretary Moore spoke of, and the role of local or regional planning, for example, the role of our different land management and conservation programs. But at the end of the day, having a permanent conserved component to that, we believe, is important, and that shouldn't then be the only kind of planning that would be involved in this. It is interesting, that we've been on record supporting another planning initiative that the agency is sponsoring right now to look at a plan for maintaining the viability of the forest products industry. And we believe it's important to also develop a plan to maintain the viability of the rural land base that supports the industry and all the other functions that we've been talking about. So I think we hope that there's room to support these planning efforts across the board, recognizing that there are severe staffing limitations at the A&R, but we would hopefully say, let's roll up our sleeves and find creative ways to fund this work. We believe in the stakeholder process that's in the bill. So again, as I mentioned quickly, and then I'll wrap up shortly here. Yes, let's look at the definitions. We don't have specific language recommendations for you today, but if the agency has certain recommendations on the language, then we'd be glad to respond to those, work with the agency to understand what would be acceptable here, and to include the necessary elements of land conservation, whether that's agriculture or other components that may be necessary. And let's see. I guess I would stop there and ask if there are any questions that I may have, any issues that I may have not covered based on the discussion that you've been having this morning.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fidel. So we've asked the administration to bring forward language that reflects their concerns about the bill as currently drafted. So we get those sooner rather than later, so that there'll be a time for others to, like the Forest Partnership and the group you're representing, to see those, take them in, and respond, to help us respond. The other thing is, I think what you wouldn't have to wait for is to be contemplating this. I mean, it seems so funding is an issue, staffing is an issue, and I can understand how they wouldn't, the agency, I mean to speak for them, but it sounds like they wouldn't want to diminish their current work in order to take on new planning work that would displace their efforts to do other conservation work. So if you can make suggestions back to the committee, ideally in draft language, about how that kind of partnership might fund such work, that could be helpful. Because I think that's one of the bottlenecks we're facing. And we're probably, as a committee, we're only formally scheduled to meet through a week from this Friday. So we're definitely up tempo. So we appreciate whatever work you can do in a timely way. I know that it requires more than just your team to work, but if you can work on that, that would be helpful. So any committee questions for Mr. Fidel? Well, thanks as always for your thoughtful input and steadiness on this work.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. And if I could just take 30 seconds more, I just want to, I mentioned before that we support this bill. This is a priority bill for the Forest Partnership. And we certainly hope that we can address whatever the concerns that have been put on the table, but still advance this bill as a priority initiative for the year. And do the necessary work that's needed and not delay addressing the importance of the underlying vision of what's trying to be accomplished here. As we've talked before, every year that we delay more attention to what's happening to our rural land base, the further we'll get behind. And why we want to continue the conservation work that's happening, taking a moment to also pause within that, or not pause, but be very strategic about how do we amplify better coordination on these efforts, we think makes a lot of sense. So thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, on the floor report in S234, I was sharing the statistic you were citing of roughly 15,000 acres a year being lost to development. And to put it into some perspective, for most people that's hard to imagine, it is 2.5 times the land base of the city of Vermont. So sizable area. All right. With that, thank you again. We'll go to Mr. Porter. Good morning, Mr. Porter. Thank you for joining us. And you've heard the conversation so far, so we're learning more about 606. We'd love to hear your input. And as it is a conversation about some concerns that have come up, and we've been taking testimony this morning, to the extent that you can respond to what you've heard, that would be helpful too. Thanks.
Well, good morning. It's great to be with you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to visit with you. And I will certainly address some of the questions that have come up already. And I'll also present some new information too for you all. But again, it's an honor to join you. Thank you, Chairman Bray and members of the committee. Why don't I start with actually the questions, some of the questions or points that were raised by the administration earlier, just to clarify some things for you all.
Sure.
Ask for
Mr. Porter, can
clarification.
you, formally introduce
Thank you.
yourself for the record so people will know
Yeah.
who we're.
Forgive me, I'm jumping in. My name is Zach Porter, and I'm the Executive Director of Standing Trees. Standing Trees is a new organization founded 2 years ago. We're composed of members from across New England. We work on restoring New England's native ecosystems, primarily with a focus on public lands, but also looking at private lands as well. And I'm based right here in Montpelier, not too far from where you all are sitting. So again, thank you for having me. I wanted to just, run through a few points, and then I'll get to some slides and share some new information with you all. Earlier today, you heard from Chair Sheldon that the estimate from the Nature Conservancy is that currently 22 to 24% of Vermont is permanently conserved. That number is not inclusive of agricultural lands. I want to make that very clear because there was a question about that came up earlier. And so if you include agricultural lands, my understanding is that Vermont is at 26% conserved. So the purpose of this bill is to focus on those lands that are conserved primarily for their natural values. And again, that's inclusive of, in this case, a wide range of management, including sustainable use of forest lands for various resources, and of course, wildlands, which we have very little of here in Vermont. So there is a huge need for this bill because 30 by 30 is still a good ways off. And not only that, we have a long way to go, even farther, when it comes to meeting the goals of Vermont conservation design as far as the quality of conservation is concerned, not just the quantity of conservation. And that is really where this bill shines, because what we have not done a good job of is to focus on the types of conservation. So this is a bill that tries to move us away from, doing what we've done a really good job of, which is to conserve lands across the state of Vermont that are used for sustainable resource management. We need that. I have a wood stove in my house that I really enjoy using in the winter. We're not moving away from that with this bill. What we're saying is we also need these lands that are managed primarily for the benefit of biodiversity, primarily for the benefit of clean water, primarily for the benefit of our climate, for resilience in the face of climate change. That's what this bill does and does well. And so just to run through a few of the other questions that were asked, right now, if we were, use value appraisal is not a fair comparison to this bill. Use value appraisal is a critical tool, but like Commissioner Snyder said, use value appraisal is in some ways a stepping stone. It's a part of that ladder, getting more people towards permanent conservation. Not everybody will choose permanent conservation, and that's okay. But use value appraisal is not a substitute for permanent conservation. Use value appraisal is an excellent program, and you're about to talk about how to make it even better with H697. But we can't just rely on use value appraisal alone. We also need a plan to make sure that we are permanently conserving a significant portion, a necessary portion of the Vermont landscape. There was a question about how much land should be left to its own devices. How much land should we allow to just be itself for its own intrinsic value? We have an answer to that question. The state of Vermont produced an excellent answer to that question in Vermont Conservation Design, saying that we need at least 9% of our forest land to be allowed to passively restore itself. And that in addition, we need to allow lands that are rare natural communities to kind of go into that passive management category as well. So, I don't know what the exact percentage would be, but somewhere on the order of 10% or slightly more than 10% is my guess, would be the amount that Vermont Conservation Design suggests is appropriate at a minimum, mind you, at a minimum for maintaining biodiversity and restoring biodiversity, meeting our climate goals in this state. And, it's important to mention that we're at 3% right now that's managed to get to the natural forest cover that once dominated Vermont. We call them old forests, but these are the natural forests of Vermont. We are a ways behind our neighbor to the west. When I look across Lake Champlain, I get a little jealous because in New York State, 125 years ago, legislators just like you established forest preserves in the Adirondacks and then the Catskills that today are the healthiest forests in the northeastern United States. And those forests comprise now 10% of New York State, 10% wild forests, striving towards old forest conditions in New York State. We're at 3% again here in Vermont. 10% is the minimum scientists tell us we should have on the landscape. I mean, the absolute minimum. 30 by 30 comes from science, not a kind of, it's not a, there's no political origin. It's actually a scientific origin. And the scientific documents that launched 30 by 30 are clear in that the 30% should be gap 1 and gap 2. And one of the things I want to talk to you about for a moment in a second here is what is gap 1 and gap 2. And these are categories of conservation, permanent conservation that focus on biodiversity. So in my mind, H606 is a very important bill, a strong bill, but it's the minimum of what we should be doing to make sure that we don't lose species that we have here today, including species that are being proposed for endangered species status right now, like the northern long-eared bat, which is under consideration right this moment for listing, and depends on old forests that we functionally don't have any of here in Vermont, according to Vermont Conservation Design today. So I think just wanted to kind of get at those few points, and if I may, I'll jump into the presentation and I'll wrap up in time to make sure that you all can ask them some additional questions. So hang tight while I just share my screen. Okay.
Looks good.
Great. And you all should have received a written copy of my testimony as well, which includes the suggested wording changes that I'll touch on. I'm going to go through this very quickly. There's more here than I can cover in the time that we have. So forgive me if I'm switching through slides rapidly. So I'll just skip through some of the intro here. I want to make sure that I stop to say that, we are all here as caretakers of land that is only ours to help for a very short period of time. We're given this gift of life here in Vermont, and it's our responsibility to make sure that we leave it better than we found it, and that we're leaving it better, looking ahead 7 generations. And so I take this responsibility very seriously, and so does every member of Standing Trees. I do this for my daughter, who is going to live in a very different Vermont, as you all have noted, 50 years from now than she lives in today. And I've also noted I really, really appreciate the patchwork quilt that is Vermont. So while I'm here to talk primarily about reaching old forests, more old forests on our landscape, I appreciate everything that we have here in Vermont. And old forests are an important component of that future Vermont, just as it was an important component of the past Vermont. There are a lot of things we don't know about climate change and about biodiversity. And it's this humility that should guide our decision-making. We need to be taking a precautionary approach as we think about how to manage our lands going forward. Pine marten, pictured here, one of those species that depends on old forest that is struggling here in Vermont. We have a water quality crisis, as you all know well, that would benefit from having more old forest on the landscape. The reasons for having more of them go on and on. Trees grow quickly in Vermont. Old forests take time. They take centuries of time. And that's why we have to make some important decisions today to make sure that future Vermonters will benefit. It takes 100, 125 years just for our forests to begin to show those characteristics of an old forest as they recover from being farm fields or pasture, as they were almost entirely 150 years ago. So old forests are incredibly important for a variety of reasons. They're complex habitats for all of the native species of Vermont, or many of the native species of Vermont. They store more carbon. They filter water and remove phosphorus better than any other kind of forest condition. These are the workhorses of our landscape. These are working forests. Old forests are absolutely working. They work harder than just about any other forest out there for each of us every day. A lot of our documents here in Vermont that we've already produced point towards the value of natural ecosystems. I won't mention all of these, but you can see them all on the screen here. You know them all well. And H606 implements all of these. That's one of the things this bill does, is it says, let's put these great ideas that we already have on paper, let's move them forward. That's what H606 is all about. So I'm gonna just skip ahead. I hope you'll forgive me. Vermont Conservation Design says the native species of Vermont evolved in a landscape dominated by old forests. Old forest is absent in Vermont as a functional component of the landscape. So that's the benchmark where we are today. That's what we have the important responsibility to change going forward. I mentioned pine marten and northern long-eared bat. I will submit this presentation as testimony so that you can also look through this and at your leisure. Old forests have greater species complexity and diversity. They have greater structural diversity than managed forests. We need managed forests. Again, I fully support a managed forests across a great deal of Vermont, but I also think we must have more wild forests. We have great researchers right here in Vermont. Dominic Tom and Bill Keaton at UVM have done outstanding research on the value of older forests. And you can read their results here. Strategies aimed at enhancing the representation of older forest conditions at landscape scales will help sustain ecosystem services and biodiversity in a changing world. This is a finding from a 2019 paper of theirs. When Vermont has looked at how to improve state land management to improve flood resiliency, they've noted that old forests simply do it better than the forests that we have in most cases on the ground today. So again, an example of a direction that we can head with H606. I've talked about carbon storage. This region is second only to the Pacific Northwest as a carbon breadbasket in the lower 48 of the United States when it comes to the amount of carbon that is stored today, and even more importantly, the amount of carbon that we could store in the future if we simply allowed a greater percentage of our forests to grow old, in addition to having wood products from our forests, all of these things, but we have to be more balanced about land management. I'm gonna race ahead here again, because I wanna save time for your questions. But as was noted earlier, the Climate Action Plan calls for exactly what H606 does, word for word just about. And I'll just jump ahead to some maps here that I think are very instructive. So again, only 3% of Vermont is managed to someday become an old forest, a natural forest. 10% of New York, again, is managed in that way today. The science behind 30 by 30 suggests 30% should be managed in GAP 1 and GAP 2. This is a map that really gives you a sense of the differences here. If you look at the Adirondack region, which is almost roughly the size of Vermont, that's a significant amount of forest that is on its way to becoming old forest. What you're seeing there is GAP 1 and GAP 2 forest land. That's where the colored in areas on this map here. And you can see how much more there is in that corner of New York State than there is across both Vermont and New Hampshire. So I'm going to leave you with these recommendations for changes to the bill. In the original version of this bill, as it was introduced in the House, there was a bit here in the conservation goals, section 2802 conservation goals here. You'll see highlighted in red, calling out, just as the Climate Action Plan does, calling out the importance of focusing on restoring old forests. These words are pulled from Vermont Conservation Design. And if we don't include that specific percentage target, I'm afraid we will continue to not make the progress that we need to make. We've been stalled for a long time on these goals in Vermont. Only recently have we started to pick up the pace thanks to organizations like Northeast Wilderness Trust and others, with the support of the state in many cases. And I want to really appreciate that, and thank the state for its support of recent projects that have gone into wild forest lands. But we need to do more of that, and it's not going to happen without more direction and really some commitment to working together towards that goal. Lastly, my last slide here, I think it would be very wise for the state of Vermont to not set itself up as separate from the way that we categorize conservation across the rest of the United States. Vermont is a part of the United States. We should not be creating our own categorization system for conservation. The definitions that are in the bill right now for ecological reserve area, biodiversity conservation area, natural resource management area, those definitions all come from one place, and that is the GAP status code assignment. That is a code that is developed by the US Geological Survey to standardize conservation. It was very intentional that this language was picked for this bill. But I think it would be even more helpful if you name GAP 1, GAP 2, GAP 3, because it makes it so that it is not so easy to get confused in the future what the intention was of the legislature. The intention was to match up our own conservation here in Vermont to these national databases so that we can easily track our progress. So it would be very wise to insert these associations back into the definitions the way I think it was originally intended, but it's not so clear as it should be right now. So I really appreciate your time today. I look forward to visiting with you more in the future. I'm always available to visit with you about this. Thank you for taking bold action on behalf of future generations here in Vermont and the life that cannot come and testify before you today that relies on our natural ecosystems. So thanks again.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for making a up-tempo presentation, because we are short on time this time of year. Are there any committee questions for Mr. Porter? I look forward to looking at your full presentation, after today's meeting. Okay, so thank you. I know it feels a little abrupt. We are going to pause.